Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined by my good friend, my erstwhile nemesis, Dr. Philip Chase. Philip, how are you doing in this new year? Happy New Year to
Well, Happy New Year, AP. This is our first video of 2023, isn't it?
you. Did we record before? No, we recorded one to have a chat.
Was it? I know it did. Wasn't it before the end of 2022 that we recorded? It's going to come out soon. Actually, it's going to come out very soon. But I think it was before 2022. And anyway, it's lovely to be here.
It's and
So
slightly unsettling because the background is different.
you're backwards. I'm completely confused and puzzled by this. I'll be looking at it like this the whole time.
Those books aren't right. It is going to take.
I know you did it to confuse me. That's a nemesis thing to do.
Well, no, we're at the start of the alphabet, but it's going to take a while to get things sorted out because I've just had to move everything around and unpack everything after the holidays. So it's going to take a while to get the setup going. But Happy New Year to you, my friend. Today, I thought an interesting thing to talk about, I think, in relation to fantasy is the othering of other fantasy races and how it is done quite often from the point of view of a reader surrogate. So you probably know what I mean here. Do you want to explain that for anyone who did not follow all of the jumbled up jargon words that I just used, or will I take a stab at it?
I mean, I'll start it and then you can take up wherever you like. But basically, what I hear you saying there is, and the classic example, maybe it helps to give an example, like Lord of the Rings, where the human surrogate in the story, the person's most closely aligned to our perspective would be the hobbits, because most of us are not epic characters from mythology. We're not kings, we're not elves, we're not dwarves, we're human. And the hobbits, even though they're halflings, pretty much they're our stand-ins, right? We most clearly identify with them. They take our place in this world where we feel the sense of awe and wonder at some of the bigger, more epic aspects of that world. That's how we would feel if I would think if you and I were thrown into Middle Earth and we were given a vision of Lothlorien, we would be pretty impressed, right? We would be in awe, I think, wouldn't you?
Well, we would be, but I can just imagine other people going, "What's your Wi-Fi password? I'm not getting a signal on my phone. Gladriel, sort this out."
That's kind of where you're going, though, right?
Yeah, essentially, when we think of all of these fantasy worlds, and there are so many amazing fantasies, but quite often at the heart of them, there is either the callow youth character, which we've talked about before, that it's the young character who goes out into the wider world and needs the world explained to them. Their level of ignorance matches the level of ignorance of the reader. And so as the character explores the world, so does the reader. And that's one way of doing it. And the base norm then is established with usually some relationship between that character as reader surrogate, that they are our portal into the world, our way of understanding the world.
Yeah.
And in a lot of fantasy then, even when they're not an inexperienced youth, when they are a seasoned veteran or anything like this, quite often the point of view character, the normal level, the diegetic reality, is attuned to the human base norm. So if we think in a fantasy realm and we take the classic Tolkien elves, the elves are long lived. And you go, well, not if you're an elf. If you're an elf, you live the regular amount of time. Humans are short lived. And that is really the simplest way to illustrate this. If elves are long lived, we have taken a perspective of what the base norm is as you live this long. And elves live longer than that, so they are other, they are strange. And that base norm is what's being applied for the narrative itself, for the diegetic sort of experience. And very often that is associated or used to normalize things for the reader. And that's why we have humans at the center of all of these stories. Or when they try to do something different, when you go, oh, but the main character of my story is an orc. And you go, right, how orcish is the orc?
Yeah.
Does the orc think of humans as being beautiful and long lived, the way that humans think of elves as being beautiful and long lived? Or
Yeah.
does the orc think of itself as being brutish and applying basically the human thought process and the comparison and contrast to humans as your base level?
There are some interesting series in this regard too. Malazan springs to mind, surprise, where I think our representatives in the Malazan Book of the Fallen are most nearly, for me anyway, the bridge burners and the bone hunters, the ordinary, soldiers there who are surrounded by entities that are way more powerful and typically way more long-lived than they are. And yet Malazan does something a little different, I feel, too, because we end up identifying with characters of other races to some degree, I think, right? I mean, that's a deliberate thing, like Jagut, for example. And the Erikson and Esselmont are playing with this otherized trope, aren't they?
Yeah.
With something like Jagut, who are clearly kind of orc in their appearance, but they are so sophisticated and so hilarious. So obviously they're tweaking us a little bit with that, aren't they?
Okay, but would we describe the Jagged as living a normal lifespan, or would we describe them as long-lived?
Long-lived, right? Yeah.
So our base norm is still rooted in the human experience.
Yes. Yeah, the
So
ordinary, the fiddlers of the world. That's us, right there.
So even if we go back to your example of the Lord of the Rings, and you go, well, how do we like the hobbits? And you go, well, the hobbits live into their mid 100s. Oh, that's much older than we. But Aragorn, as the sort of the prototypical example of the best of men, the best of humans, lives in excess of 200 years. So lives much longer than the hobbits. The dwarves live longer than the hobbits. The elves live longer than the hobbits. So from the hobbit perspective, everyone else is kind of long-lived. Now, obviously, that's because Aragorn is descended from Numenor rather than the sort of the base level men. There are subtleties and nuances there. But you can see that argument that the hobbits, because they are rooted in that experience, form that base level reality through which we perceive the rest of the world, the wider fantastical world. And with Malazan, when we shift to the other points of view, the human or the anthrocentric perspective has already been well established. It's about the Malazan Empire and the different soldiers who are in the Malazan Empire. And the Malazan Empire is, despite other citizens of other races being in it, is a human empire. And that is the base level exploration. And you think even in science fiction, when we go to these far off, bizarre alien worlds, it's almost always with a human analog or an actual human as our point of view character, because otherwise we have no way of grasping how alien the alien is. And one of the few series, I think, on TV and books that did this quite well was The Expanse. Because when you're in those cultures, the cultures aren't explained to you. You just experience them. It's immersive. And so the Belters have a very specific culture that they use. But again, all of The Expanse is basically about humans. And so it's shades of humanity rather than truly otherizing. It's a much more nuanced form of otherizing as opposed to the kind of quite blunt elf, troll, orc, human, these very blunt categorizations.
I agree. Yeah, there's nuance in. I thought of Star Trek when you said that about science fiction and the various iterations of Star Trek. In fact, if I go back to the one I'm most familiar with, which is the original, you have a basically human perspective with Captain Kirk and the others, but you do have Spock, right, who's sort of half human and half Vulcan. And one of the interesting things they're doing there is they're exploring a slightly non-human perspective. That's part of what the series is about, though, right? I mean,
yeah, but Spock is always contrasted to the base human norm.
Exactly, and he's got those two halves Elves too. Yeah.
And also, I mean, if you think if an episode of Star Trek was a brand new alien species, and the entire episode was just this alien species going about like their struggle, and then at the very end, Kirk beamed down to go, "Aha, we're here to do that." It'd be very difficult to understand what was going on because we don't have that perspective. We have to have that assumption of the human norm. James Eng's The Wolf Age, which I think does the othered race of the werewolf so well, to almost the detriment of the reading experience with the names, which I've talked about before.
The unpronounceable wolf names.
The lupine nomenclature. But in that, the society, they talk about their social standing in terms of bite. And they wear these necklaces with wolf teeth on it from people who they have defeated in combat, and then they take their teeth because they have assumed their level of social standing. There's this whole sort of social grouping. But because the point of view character is ostensibly human and being introduced to it, it's slowly fed and explained to the reader. If the book had just started out with werewolf characters going, his bite isn't big enough, and none of it was ever explained, it would be very difficult. It's possible to do, but it almost becomes a writing exercise rather than something that is enjoyable to read, because we need that bridge quite often as human readers. And we see it a lot in any of these series that involve multiple races, that the baseline humanity is always assumed as that is normal. Everything else is a deviation. And we see it like really, really clearly in a lot of role-playing games. Humans are the base norm. Elves have more dexterity than humans. Dwarves have more constitution than humans. Everything is done in relation to the human base norm. That's how you calculate things. They don't say humans have less dexterity than elves. It's always the human is the base norm. And it's a very bizarre system because it does end up otherizing everything and assuming a base level normalcy on an assumption about what humanity is.
Now that's an interesting point, because as you were speaking, I was just thinking about it actually, how this is a mechanism through which you can either reinforce stereotypes or you can explore them through this othering of these different races. And I think different authors approach it differently, but again, going back to Malazan, this is a clearly deliberate exploration of otherizing in that case, and different races meeting up with one another and finding their, if I can use the phrase, common humanity. Very human-centric way to put it, isn't it? But you know what I mean, right?
And brief spoiler warning for House of Chains. At the start of House of Chains, one of the best examples of this is the opening of House of Chains when we meet the character of Karsa Orlong. And he and his friends are a tribal society, and they go, we're going to go and kill the children.
The children, yeah.
And as a reader, you're automatically shocked. You are freaked out by this. Like this, and none of their society is explained. None of what is going on is explained. You're meant to pick it up from context clues. And then when you arrive basically in the human city, and you realize, no, Karsa isn't human. He's a giant. And the reason they think of humans as children is that they are incredibly short-lived and they're tiny. They aren't fully grown. So they think of humans as children. And think of how many readers are really off-put by that opening section with Karsa, because it's not explained.
It's not explained because you're getting their perspective. Why would they stop and think, well, we call them children because, right?
Exactly, because when that is your base level of reality, you wouldn't explain it to anyone. So if you're very immersed in a point of view, if you're focalizing through a character and you're trying to stay true to that, that's where you would have, say, an info dump suddenly being would be intruding into the narrative, be inserted in there to go, dear reader, basically these are giants. He's 15 feet tall, and all of this stuff that suddenly would take you out of the narrative, but would give you the context. But
Yeah.
that's why I think that's one of the reasons why that section is so disconcerting to read, because
Mm.
our assumption going in is based on no, but if he's a human, then they're going to kill children. And we never think about it from the perspective of he is not a human, because that is our base norm. And when we establish base norms like that, when we make assumptions about the base norm, this is where we see things about gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, culture, these things creeping in because it's an assumed base norm.
Yeah.
And if it is never challenged, it can become pervasive and actually quite detrimental to storytelling. And
Yeah.
we then actually end up absorbing it without thought. And that's why we trip up with the Karsa section, because we have a whole load of unconscious biases that the Karsa
You know,
section is deliberately challenging.
that is so true. And it's so interesting, that particular example, because Karsa is going through a sort of a mirror process, isn't he? Because he also has this one very strong view of the world, and he's going through the process of being exposed to a bigger world of understanding just how parochial his existence has been up until then. So our assumption as reader is eventually challenged in terms of, oh, I had the totally wrong perspective here on this, while his perception as a character is similarly being challenged at the same time, because he is wearing this very, biased lens as well that is going to be stripped from him. I'm not going to say more than that because I don't want to go too far in the spoilers, but
Yeah.
but he's being exposed to a world that he has no idea about.
And that challenging of worldview. And one of the reasons it's so interesting, because it goes to this concept that we talk about the integration of the fantastic into the diegetic reality, into the story world. And when
Yeah.
something is truly integrated, when it becomes part of that story world, it is no longer other, it is normalized. And so
Mm-hmm.
if you have magic being commonplace, if, for instance, wizards are a dime a dozen and they can all cast fireball spells, having a character that then goes, oh my God, he cast a fireball spell, you go, that feels out of place. Because if you were living in that world and wizards were commonplace and they could cast fireball spells, when it happens, it would be as everyday as seeing someone drive past in a car. If flying carpets existed as a mode of transport and someone goes past it, we would have the same attitude to the flying carpet that we would have to cars and traffic in this world, that it becomes mundane. And there's a really interesting tension between creating a believable, authentic reality that has these fantastical elements that a reader is going to perceive as fantastic because we don't have them, but that a character is going to see as mundane. And that is a really delicate tightrope sometimes to walk. If you have to put this in perspective, if you have an entire society of elves and no human characters, and you're telling an Elvish story set in an Elvish city with Elvish characters, they are never going to see each other as strange and ethereal. They're going to see them the way that we see each other, as in normal. And as soon as the characters see everything around them as normal, how do you represent that they are not human? That they are strange and ethereal? Because they're only strange and ethereal from a human perspective, not from an Elvish perspective. So creating that level of mundanity reduces the level of the fantastic reality in the diegesis down to the mundane. And then you think about, well, if you then introduce a human character, how would you make the human character look? You have assumed the elves as the base norm. So the humans, think of how we think of elves. They're tall, they are beautiful, they are ethereal. So you would do the opposite. You would have your human characters. They would be short. They would be
crude. Yeah.
They would be ugly. that's how you would cast it to show the elvish level of sort of mundanity and how they would see humans.
But you're describing the Silmarillion right now, essentially, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the earlier parts after the creation part, the earlier parts of the Silmarillion, just elves. Humans are the latecomers. We're the second children of Iluvatar. And when we come along, the elves are like, ugh. You know what I mean? We're brutish and short-lived, and that's the perspective initially of the humans. Is it is an elvish perspective. So yeah, in a way, I mean, I don't know if Tolkien, I mean, obviously the Silmarillion is not the perfect example because it's a bunch of different stories put together, but you see what I mean, right?
Yeah, and it hasn't been smoothed out into a
Right.
single narrative. It's slightly inconsistent in its register, shall we say?
Yeah. So in the later books, it's much more human centered, but in the earlier ones, it's elvish. And whenever humans arrive, I think the perspective is from the elves more than the humans, at least initially.
Yeah, but it's such a fascinating tension because you can see why that would be difficult then. Because if the elves see the humans the way that humans see, say, orcs or goblins,
Yeah.
and then we have all of these pairings of this elf woman falls in love with this heroic man, and you go, how heroic would an orc have to be for the human woman to fall in love with the orc? If we're going on that sort of thing, because that's the disparity that we think about. But because we always think about it in terms of the human first and then the elf, oh, of course this beautiful woman falls in love with me.
But what Tolkien didn't tell you is that Luthien was very nearsighted, so she didn't know what Beren looked like.
They hadn't invented glasses in those days. There's no LASIK either.
Right.
But and when you start playing around with this, you can do what Erikson did with House of Chains. Like you can start playing around with this concept of the different levels of perception and the relative perceptions between races. Because how different would an orc perceive humans and elves? Are they radically different? Or from an orcish perspective, would they be relatively similar and harder to distinguish? Because they're both tall, they're both finer looking.
It's really interesting because you do have half breeds in these various worlds. Like we talked about Beren and Luthien, and Elrond and his brother Elros, of course, were the half elven. In Malazan, you have various characters who are half something else. So
and like you, half friend, half nemesis.
Exactly. So what's being explored is, I think it's fascinating because it is a parallel to what some people who have parents from different parts of the world, for example, in our world live through, which is the feeling of hybridity, the feeling of not completely belonging in this space or that space, but being something in a kind of limbo with access to both those spaces, but never feeling 100% like one of those things. So it's an interesting thing. And it does get explored, I think, in both those examples pretty well.
And in fact, like one of the often academically derided series, the Dragonlance series by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, a central character in that is Tanis Half-Elven. And part of the storyline explores how, as a half-elf, he decides to grow a beard because he's not accepted, even though he lived a lot of his life in the elf realm.
Yeah.
He wasn't accepted there. And when he comes into the human realm, in order to fit in, it's better to have a beard because his ears single him out. He doesn't fit in either world. And it's absolutely fine for a series that a lot of people criticize. There are some fascinating things being done in a way that was easily accessible in mainstream genre fiction based on a role-playing game. And it questioned that concept of hybridity or even code switching and aspects of personality. And we can see how that then gets explored in a more general sense and can be applied in a more general sense to, as you said, people with parents from different cultures or different ethnicities or different religions, depending on your part of the world. And because of that, there can be an element of code switching and an element of not fitting in and trying to understand these things. And it all has
Being
to do
sent.
with this perception of the base norm. And if
Yep.
you are part of the assumed base norm, you never see it.
Yep.
But if you're not part of that base norm, it is amazing how obvious it is in places.
Yeah.
We are blind quite often to those things.
Yep. And the people who are half base norm and half other really have, I think, an interesting perception on all of that. So, yeah.
But
Interesting what you do.
yeah, and it is the concept of otherness. Like, we've talked about this before, but otherness is not necessarily a bad thing. You know, we talk about othering, and quite often it's viewed in a very negative sense because it is a simplistic othering of someone. But othering as a tool, if you understand it, if you know how to deploy it, if you know what it's doing, if you know that you are othering, then it can be a fascinating tool for an author to utilize for that effect.
Well, and that's also the effect that one has, or at least one hopes that has the effect on a reader. When you're the Hobbit or you're the human perspective character, you go on the adventure, you're exposed to these different races, these different peoples who have different norms, who live longer or whatever. You come back different. You're not the same. You've been exposed to other things that have now changed your perception, and you're a more experienced individual with a bigger appreciation for a bigger world. That's part of the whole deal, isn't it? I mean, that's part of the whole, I mean, that's at the heart of a lot of fantasy, I think.
And this is something a lot of us experience just generally as we live. Like, and you, I think, probably have experienced this as well. When you travel and spend time in another culture, you are challenged on, not necessarily that someone will say you're not allowed to do that here, but suddenly things that were assumed, you can't make those assumptions anymore. And when you go back, when you return home, home looks different, home feels different, because suddenly things that you just accepted, you now see with new eyes. And it's because your evaluation of the base norm has shifted.
So not only do you understand the broader world more, you understand yourself more because you have that perception of yourself from the outside now.
And that it's a fascinating to go from being, say, one of the accepted majority to suddenly being a minority somewhere shifts your perception radically. Going from one culture to an entirely different culture, or even one that is close, but not quite. And quite often it's the little changes then that trip you up, that you go, oh, didn't see that because it was so close to normal. And this concept of the base norm and othering and what we see in fantasy, I think, has very strong parallels to our own lives about our perception of what is normal. And that applies outside of fiction then to how we see the world around us. And again, like as we always say, reading broadly, reading widely, reading deeply, all of these things broaden and deepen and enrich our understanding, not only of the literature, not only of ourselves, but of the world that we actually live in. And, you know, I think one of the great strengths is it makes us more flexible and adaptable.
Yeah, I agree. I think that one of the impulses at the heart of fantasy is to explore and to venture out. And that is inevitably going to lead to a different person at the end of the journey, both the character and the reader. And that's really part of the beauty of the genre, isn't it?
Yeah. But anything else that you would like to add? This was a fun discussion because it popped into my head about these assumptions that we make about other fantasy races. And I thought it would be fun to discuss. So is there anything that you want to add to this, Philip?
Just that it has been fun having this conversation with you, my friend, and interacting with you, with my nemesis, is always a very culturally enlightening experience. So, I thank you for that, and I thank your viewers for putting up with me again.
And For those of you still watching, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and we will see you in the next one.